Hello, my name's Alison Organ and I'm Programme Lead for European Languages at York St John University. For the last few years I've been interested in the impact of Google Translate on my language students. In this talk I'll be exploring what Google Translate is and how it works, what it's good and bad at, and the issues it raises for language learners and teachers. I'll be revealing a startling coincidence which has a direct effect on the language learning process. Universal translators have been popular in science fiction for years. Which of these are real, and which are the products of fiction? The Star Trek communicator pin from the Paramount television series in the 60s was used to communicate instantly with aliens. Similarly, the Babel fish in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams in 1978 was inserted into the ear to allow the user to understand any language. Google Glass, created in 2014, allows the wearer to show what they're seeing to a third party and translate any text they're reading. Google Pixel Buds, available since 2017, enable the wearer to hold a conversation with someone despite not speaking their language. Google Translate is often in the headlines. It's often claimed to be the ultimate solution for communication between languages, rendering translators and interpreters redundant in the not-too-distant future. Sometimes, however, reporters poke fun at the errors it makes, or go further to suggest that these could have serious consequences. One of the first people to suggest that language could be translated by a machine was Warren Weaver, an American mathematician, who suggested that language was just a code which could be deciphered. He did qualify this later, however, acknowledging that the translation process involves more than just word-for-word translation. The early forms of machine translation were based on statistical probability. Rule-based machine translation combined the dictionary with grammatical rules to produce a lexically and syntactically accurate sentence. The problem was that it could only translate words which were in its database. Phrase-based machine translation was based on the analysis of data from parallel text collections. The selected phrase is chosen as the most statistically probable match. Training data was taken from parallel corpora, bodies of parallel text, such as documents from the United Nations, the Canadian Parliament, and the European Union. However, because of the natural ambiguity and flexibility of human language, these systems still led to frequent errors in syntax and context. An example of a simplified phrase-based system was devised in Canada in the 1970s for weather forecasting. As you can see from this example, there's a limited list of phrases to choose from, which have an exact equivalent in the other language. Google Translate was launched in 2006, using a statistical, phrase-based machine translation system. This was replaced in 2016 by Google's Neural Machine Translation System, which offered a step change in the accuracy and scope of the translations provided. Google Translate is now used by more than 500 million monthly users, searching for 140 billion words per day. This graph shows how the quality of translations has increased through rule-based and statistical systems and is now continuing to rise with the neural translation system. So, how does it work? As the name suggests, it's designed to function in a similar way to the human brain, making connections and learning new information. This process does not generate sentences directly into the target language as the previous systems did. Neural machine translation performs an analysis in two stages, encoding and decoding, by a process called deep learning. Here's Google's own graphic representation of what's happening. Importantly, As a step forward from the previous systems, which proceeded word by word or phrase by phrase, the encoding of each new word takes into account what has happened earlier in the sentence. The Economist devoted a long section of its Technology Quarterly in 2017 to the advent of neural machine translation, quoting an intriguing analogy by Marcello Federico. He compares the phrase-based translation to describing Coca-Cola in terms of sugar, water, caffeine, and other ingredients, while neural net translation encodes features such as liquidness, darkness, sweetness, and fizziness. As you can see in this graph showing their analysis of test translations, Google claimed that neural machine translation, in green, is fast approaching human translation, in orange, particularly in European languages. In 2016, there were 2.5 billion sentence pairs in the training material for English and French, and 500 million for English and Chinese. So, what's Google Translate good at? According to Douglas Hofstadter, Professor of Cognitive Science at Indiana University, one of the foremost writers on the art of translation, it effects quick and dirty conversions of meaningful passages written in language A into not necessarily meaningful strings of words in language B. As long as the text in language B is somewhat comprehensible, many people feel perfectly satisfied with the end product. If they can get the basic idea of a passage in a language they don't know, they're happy. We put this to the test in a light-hearted experiment by entering a simple request for accommodation in English into Google Translate, translating it into multiple languages and then back again into English. This was the result. It starts impressively by translating yours sincerely into the equivalent French salutation. After that, it goes a little off the rails, as in German the vocabulary and syntax are still correct, but it is now using the familiar du form, which would not be appropriate. The final return into English is, as Hofstadter says, quick and dirty, meaning it's not perfect, but it does the job. If you Google computer translation better than humans, you'll not surprisingly find multiple entries from translation agencies claiming that this is impossible for various reasons such as lack of insight, understanding of the big picture, and the risk of unprofessional errors. Coming back to Hofstadter, who wrote a fascinating 800-page book on the multiple different ways one could translate a short poem, the reason machine translation can never equal human translation is because it denotes a profoundly human art form that graciously carries clear ideas in language A into clear ideas in language B. And the bridging act should not only maintain clarity, but also give a sense for the flavour, quirks, and idiosyncrasies of the writing style of the original author. Hofstadter tested Google Translate on an apparently simple sentence. In their house, everything comes in pairs. There's his car and her car, his towels and her towels, and his library and hers. Although his article was written in 2018, I discovered that Google produces the same results now as he reported then. Let's see what happened. We put the source text into the box and ask for the French translation. It's fine, apart from in its use of possessive adjectives, whose gender in French depends on the noun they refer to, such as car, not the gender of the possessor, so his car and her car are both sa voiture in French. The Spanish translation is struggling too. We then enter Hofstadter's own suggested French translation, which spells out the genders much more clearly, belonging to him and belonging to her. But for some reason, Google can't cope with that either, which seems illogical. The other feature to point out here is the way in which the neural system learns, by asking its users to judge or improve on the translation, or join the Google Translate community for a more active role in its development, or send feedback. By 2019, several trillion words were being entered into machine translation systems worldwide. Users often do not realize that they're entering potentially sensitive data into an external portal owned by a different company, and that this content is subject to the terms of use agreements that entitle the machine translation provider to store, modify, reproduce, distribute, and create derivative works. The industry-leading language management company SDL has documented several security breaches in recent years. For example, in 2017, a Norwegian news agency reported data that they had found on a free translation site, including notices of dismissal, plans of workforce reductions and outsourcing, passwords, code information, and contracts. In 2019, a US company discovered that as much as 3 to 5 gigabytes of content was being cut and pasted into public translation portals every day, including sensitive HR issues and other confidential content. In 2019, too, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute published a report claiming that China uses state-owned companies, which provide machine translation services, to collect data on users outside China. It's clear that Google Translate is a very useful, if risky, tool for people lacking knowledge of the target language. But what issues does it raise for language learners? In an effort to find out to what extent students were reaching for this tool, I carried out some research in 2018, as yet unpublished, into posts on the Student Room forum. This is an open access forum for students at any level of education to ask each other questions. I found 63 posts and 143 responses from 2010 to 2018, which mentioned Google Translate in the context of language learning, mostly referring to GCSE coursework. When I analysed them to see what the nature of their inquiry was, I was shocked to discover that the majority were asking fellow students to either write, translate, or correct their work for them. Others were asking for general exam tips. Some wanted to know whether it counted as cheating if they used Google Translate, and others whether their teacher would be able to spot it. When I analysed the responses, 35% showed a negative view and 21% a positive view, with the remainder being inconclusive. Negative comments included the fact that results would be inaccurate or the teacher would be able to spot it, although it must be remembered that most of these posts date from before the advent of Google's neural system. Others criticised the inquirer for laziness or cheating, which at least offers some solace to language teachers. Positive comments were as shocking as the original inquiries. Many respondents admitted having used Google Translate for their coursework, some with excellent results. Perhaps in the light of this, it's no bad thing that coursework is no longer a component of the GCSE, but it's still worrying that so many students were reaching for Google Translate. This led me to further research into undergraduate usage. I sent surveys to university students and staff in 2018. One of the questions I was interested in was why students used Google Translate. The majority of students reported using it because of a lack of confidence in their ability, while most staff assumed it was to save time or effort. In order to understand what effect this will have on their learning capacity, we need to explore what happens in the brain of a language learner. When two neurons respond to a stimulus, such as a word, they begin to form chemical and physical pathways to each other, which are strengthened or weakened depending on how often they are co-activated. In his book, Learning Vocabulary in Another Language, Paul Nation explains that productive retrieval includes wishing to communicate the meaning of the word and having to retrieve its spoken or written form, and that retrieval does not occur if the form and its meaning are presented simultaneously to the learner. Nation quotes Alan Baddeley, Professor of Psychology at the University of York, who's devoted his career to the study of working memory. Baddeley argues that it's not simply repetition which is important, but the repeated opportunity to retrieve the item which is to be learned, and that each retrieval of a word strengthens the path linking the form and meaning, and makes subsequent retrieval easier. So, language learners need to form neural pathways in order to remember words in the foreign language. What does that remind us of? Of course, Google's neural translation system. So, by going for the quick fix and using Google Translate to seek the translation for them, language learners are handing over the language learning process to the computer. Remember what Nation said. Retrieval does not occur if the form and its meaning are presented simultaneously to the learner. Uptake for GCSE exams in modern languages has been steadily falling over the last decade, apart from a very slight rise in Spanish. According to this article in The Telegraph, commenting on this trend, Professor Alan Smithers of the University of Birmingham said that British children were spoiled and had grown up in a world where everyone speaks English, everything they read and watch is in English or is translated, and when they do need to translate, they have access to tools such as Google Translate. Language teachers too are struggling with this phenomenon. In answer to a tweet posted in 2018 by a French teacher in London, asking for advice on how to deal with a pupil who'd used Google Translate for his homework, respondents were largely unforgiving, suggesting he be made to do it again without help. Some suggested that it be used as a learning activity to point out to pupils the issues we've discussed in this talk, and reminding them that they'll not have access to the tool in their exams. Authors of the Language Teacher Toolkit, Smith and Conti, are sympathetic, but argue that by putting up a really strong front, supported by whatever whole department or whole school mechanisms are needed, and setting written tasks which discourage simple direct translation, it's possible to limit the damage. And finally, what effect is this having on language teaching and assessment in universities like mine? Over the last few decades, there's been a move away from final exams in favour of coursework, presentations, essays and research projects. This involves the students preparing work in their own time. This presents us with a dilemma: what to do about students using Google Translate for their submissions. For the last 2 years, academics from across the world have been coming together at the University of Nottingham to debate this issue and share their responses to it. Some are choosing to move back to assessing under exam conditions, while those which value coursework submission have addressed the problem in other ways. This might be by asking the students for a declaration that they've not used translation tools, or by amending the assessment criteria to lessen the weighting for language and increase the importance of the content and argumentation. Many academics echo the comments made by teachers about educating the students to use the tool critically, rather than depending on it in blind faith. So, where do we go from here? To quote my colleague, the genie is out of the bottle. However we choose to proceed, we can't turn back the clock and expect students not to exploit a tool which is free, quick, user-friendly and increasingly accurate. As language professionals, we'll just have to use our own neural pathways to develop creative methods of training and assessing them. Thank you for listening.